Hello, this is Ramirez with Tidewater Renaissance Fighting Arts, and today I want to talk a little bit about the past, present, and future of tips on HEMA weapons. And I know this is a controversial topic, and if you're in Europe, this may not be as relevant because your club will kind of dictate, do you even need to have a tip on there or not? If you're in London Longsword Academy, you will. Other places, you might not. I'm not here to argue whether or not it's a good idea or it's a bad idea. But in America, where I'm from, many clubs require tips on weapons, and many tournaments require tips on weapons. So if you want to compete, guess what? That argument about whether or not it's a good idea, bad idea doesn't come into it. You're going to have to put a tip on your weapon. So I think it's important that we look at both the past, the present, and the future. And this is one thing I've really been looking forward to. Purple Heart Armory gave me two of their experimental tips to play with. So we're going to talk about those at the end of the video. So stay tuned. But I think it's going to be an interesting journey to talk about this. Now, just for background, I started doing Olympic fencing in the late 80s. I went into historical fencing through the SCA in the 90s. And then I've progressed through and I've seen modern HEMA and what we do now, fighting with longsword, as well as rapier and other weapons. And as I said, I got these experimental tips from Purple Heart that we might be seeing in the future. You may be seeing right now because they are starting to get released into the competitive populace. So let's start out with the beginning. Modern day Olympic fencing weapons had rubber tips, and they were small little things you just pop over the rolled over end on an épée or foil, which might have a button, stop. And I think that we should also talk about the different ways that Olympic and early HEMA weapons were made, because the idea of the spatulated tip is a relatively new design. It was blunt, it was rounded or had a folded end at the end of it, or it had a button end. And what that means is that the end of the blade, if you think about early rapier Hanwei blades, had this. The end of the rapier would actually be flattened out and it would look like the head of a nail. Not quite as big, but it would be a little bit of a button at the stop end of most of those weapons. And the regular kind of fencing, Olympic fencing blunts were just not big enough to accommodate those kind of button ended rapiers. So what people started out using was something from archery called a bird blunt. And you'll notice that that tip is very different. It has a very wide bore at the end of it that could accommodate. This is largely more plastic than rubber. It doesn't have the same type of grip. We'll come to see that this may be coming back into vogue in a certain way in its modern incarnation. But this is what a lot of people used as their tips on the early kind of rapier style, a thicker blade, what now is, I guess, called the musketeer style rapier blade. And you would use this. Now, go fast forward a little bit. These do become a little bit more of a rubber style. I want to go to this one, which is an example of one that is in vogue, has a wider bore. Not quite as wide as the bird blunt, but it does have a little bit more of a rubbery consistency. Probably looks like a blunt you might see today for rapier combat. Then there was a problem. A company that I won't name because they're still active in the HEMA community created this blunt. And you'll notice that it has a very, very narrow slit that you could theoretically put not a rolled tip wouldn't fit in here, but one that was blunted. Now you have to understand, the idea of the spatulated tip at that time didn't exist. Like, people really weren't making weapons like that. So this was meant for ones that had kind of a blunted end and you could kind of stuff that in there. The problem with these was that the rubber, with that small a hole, um, you could literally, this would just tear in two. If it was pushed hard enough against something, this would just split open, and then you had basically a blunted blade that you were fighting with. So these very quickly, they were controversial in their day. I have one for historical record, but they kind of got a very, very bad reputation and were very quickly discontinued. I do not believe you can get one of these in the modern day at any HEMA event. So that brought us back this rubbery one with the big hole in it. And people were terrified because of what was going on with this blunt and them tearing, that you needed to not only put this, but you needed some sort of washer, some sort of metal inside here to stop a blade from basically tearing through the rubber and going out. And so they would use a washer much smaller than this one, and it would kind of stick it in there and jam it down. And that would mean that you had this wider kind of washer against the metal to make it wider so it couldn't just pierce through the rubber blunts. And that kind of brings us to today. So modern HEMA, if you go to Purple Heart or anywhere, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it or not, they have a washer preset into the blunt. And that doesn't matter if it is a longsword blunt or it is a rapier blunt. I know you probably can't see it in there, but there is a metal washer in there. And the one blunt I didn't bring out that I really wanted to was the one I used for the harness fecton swords and the spears. I think I have one on a weapon here. This is a much larger blunt, and it's not technically a blunt. It's actually for canes. You put it at the end of a walking stick. They're much wider bores, but even these have that metal washer in it. So that way it prevents the weapon, the blade point, from coming through the tip of the weapon. Some downsides to these were that if you notice that this rubber blunt has a little seam where it gets round, that's obviously where these are kind of fused together. And I have had it happen to me in practice where someone has sheared this off in a strike, and we literally heard the washer inside hit the ground, and everyone was like, what's going on? But that's one way we could very quickly identify, oh crap, this doesn't have a tip on it, and then stop and replace the tip. I have never seen that happen with these guys because I think they secure a little bit better in the assembly process. But neither here nor there, we do have washers in these things to stop them from being able to pierce through. And that brings us to the modern argument for what should you use. Now, some people say, why do we need the rubber tips to affect impact? In other words, we're dispersing the area from just like, even with a spatulated tip, a very thin surface area, you're in essence spreading that force, so you're disseminating how much power on a hit is going to actually hit you. And once again, force is mass times acceleration, and more importantly, you're concentrating that area of pressure if you just have a spatulated tip. So potentially this helps disperse that. Now there is another reason we have tips on weapons, and that is to determine whether or not the tip of the blade has broken, which means you need a visual indicator. And that's where something like people are doing now is just, this is an example of a leather tip, and that means you just wrap this around the end, you tape it down, and you start fighting. And the thing is, if you can see the tip, you know the weapon is still intact. If all you see is steel, 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 and no tip, you know the weapon is broken, and therefore you can call a hold. Also, with leather, you have some grip, but I know the big issue with rubber tips is they have too much grip and they lead to concussions, etc. I'm a little iffy on the argument there, but I'm not here to discuss that. I am here to discuss the fact that this, once again, wrapped over a spatulated tip or even a rolled tip, is going to once again increase the surface area, reduce the amount of force, but it doesn't have the rubbery grip that a rubber tip has. But the other downside is you can't really put a washer into this and have that kind of system work. So if this breaks for some reason, if enough pressure is put on it, enough wear on the leather, and someone's not checking gear, this could theoretically just split open on this side. Split open, and now you're back to having just the spatulated or the rolled tip blade hitting someone. But properly maintained, these could work fine. They could reduce the amount of grip that a rubber tip has. But, and here's where it's kind of important, read the rules for your competition, or for your club for that matter, about what type of tips they allow. Some competitions require that there's a washer in the tip. If that's the case, this really isn't going to cut it. But I've seen events that don't know their own rules. Like they'll say it requires a washer, but then they'll see this tip and they'll be like, oh yeah, that's fine, without checking for that washer. So it depends on the rule set. I say always just be mindful of what the rule set is. So let's talk about this is now. These 3 rubber tips or 2 rubber tips and leather, that's more or less what we're doing now. These are, of course, the tips of the past. What's in our future? So Purple Heart, Christian at Purple Heart was kind enough to share with me some of the designs he's working on. And I don't know that all of these are available. You'd have to contact Purple Heart directly. But the first one is this one, which looks very much like Purple Heart's old one. The difference is this has a much more higher plastic content. It is not rubber in the same sense. It has some flex to it, but it is nowhere near like this is the old one. That rubber, it has more of a plastic component. It doesn't really have as much of the grippy rubber that's on this one. These are, as I said, they're new. They are, I think, in the experimental range still. They do feature the metal washer insert. And probably in a lot of competitions, this may be the future to prevent that rubber grip issue. The downside is that it doesn't flex very much, and Christian said if you have a really wide spatulated blade, you may need to cut a little bit of the end to get it in there, because it doesn't have the flex, because it's not the same type of rubber consistency that the old, or I guess what's currently on the market, is. Next is one that is, there is no washer in here. This literally has a little space for the spatulated tip, or Christian said, the rolled tip as well. And you just fold it around, and then you just tape it to your weapon. Now, how does this necessarily protect? It's along the same lines as this, but remember when I said about tips and breakage? This is, and every one of these, there's one in bright blue, bright yellow, bright green, is that this is a visual cue. If this is on the tip of your weapon, you know that the weapon is intact. If you're in the middle of sparring in something and a sword breaks, this tip won't be on there, and then you know to call a hold, the weapon isn't safe. So there's kind of this twofold reasoning for tips. And when I was at Icebreaker, he was handing these out to a couple of people who had put them on their blades. They're wide enough for the Siggy spatulated blades, which are pretty wide on their spatulation, to cover them. Uh, I haven't gotten a chance to test that out because I'm right now between tournaments, and my tournaments require that they have a tip with a washer in it, so I can't use that tip in the next tournament I'm going to. So I'm going to wait to test this out till the rest of my tournaments for the year are over. Then I'll go ahead and put that on a weapon and start testing it out. But the questions of why should we have tips, and that's for visibility and breakage, and also dispersion of force. And we as a HEMA community have to decide, club by club, tournament by tournament, what risks we want to take and why. There have been controversies right now with someone getting severely injured and punctured through a jacket. Would that have happened if they had a tip on there? Would a colored tip like that have fixed the problem? I don't know. I don't know all the details of that. And once again, it's not why I'm here to do this video. What I am here to say is, if you are going to be like, I don't like tips, maybe the leather or this new future tip might be the thing that you could get behind. As far as events and safety, they're going to have to determine whether or not something that has a washer in it. As I said, there is this new version. It's more plasticky, less grip on the masks. It does have the washer in it. That may be where we're going. So it's something that we should kind of keep in mind looking to the future of tips in HEMA. And that, you can't just say, well, I don't like tips. If you show up at a tournament that requires it, you're going to have to use one. So it's good to know what your options are. It's good to check and be in contact with an event. Say, hey, if I just put a piece of leather on there, is that good enough? Or does it have the washer requirement? Because as I start looking at more and more HEMA tournaments, I'm noticing those rules starting to get a little more strict, or at least being aware and acknowledging what they will allow. So if I show up with this and someone requires a washer, this isn't going to have it, nor is this. But if I go with the currently available blunts, they do have that washer in there. And if I go into the next generation, they also have that washer in there. So once again, you could say, hey, I hate tips, but then you might have the choice of, do I continue a competitive career in HEMA or not? Or you go to Europe, because I know that many of the European competitions don't require tips. So I would, once again, check with your tournaments. But in the United States, I can't think of, and I'm happy to be corrected. If someone wants to tell me a U.S. competition doesn't require you to have a tip on your HEMA weapons, but as of right now, I haven't seen any. So it's something that we're going to have to deal with. But there are some things coming out. And we also have to determine if you're running a club or running a tournament, is just knowing if the tip is broken sufficient? Or do you really want the added safety of that washer and wide-ended tip to reduce the overall force of the weapon? So that's it. That's my tip video, past, present, and future. I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, my name is Ramirez. I'm part of Tidewater Renaissance Fighting Arts. I'll leave more information about our club in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.